Russia really just has to crush Ukraine in this war. I wish it wasn't that way, but I think that's what we're looking at. They have to actually be crushed, and in crushing Ukraine, with Western support, but the West maybe finally will understand that, okay, we can no longer be contemptuous of these people. We need to respect them, and we need to recognize their concerns and respond to them. We're just not there yet. You just don't even hardly see any signs of that outside of a couple of dissident governments, like Slovakia and Hungary, and some dissident political parties in the West. Well, the only place where you see, I guess, a sign of that is maybe in the mind of Donald Trump and a couple of his advisors. But it's just so very inconsistent. It's just sort of like he does seem to be waking up to this fact, but he's still mired in the old way of thinking. Right now he seems to be drifting towards closer to the Russians, but who knows? And that is infuriating the other Western leaders. They see this happening. But Trump's attitude, Trump will really be put to the test when a major Russian offensive is launched. And of course, we're expecting that to happen pretty soon. Again, it's like when the Russian army starts marching to the Dnieper, or maybe marching towards Kiev, or crosses the Dnieper and starts heading towards Nikolaev or something like that. There's going to be, just a tremendous amount of angst and anger and fear, on the Western side, and Trump is going to feel enormous pressures. I don't know if he's really prepared himself for that. I mean, it was going to be tough for him. Like we said, like one of the things that he fears most is an Afghan moment and being being humiliated by a loss. It would be pinned on him. I think if at this point it very easily could be, especially if he does slow down or cut off supplies of arms and intelligence. Now, again, he did that very briefly, for maybe just a few days, a couple of months ago, right? And I think we're coming to the end of the aid package. Basically, the arms that were allocated under Biden is supposed to run out, I think, within a month or two. And there will be a need for another, support package by the U.S. And, the question that's always in my mind is like, yeah, he doesn't want to pay it. His base doesn't. But if he doesn't, and then shortly thereafter, you just see a true collapse on the Ukrainian lines, everybody will start screaming and say that, this was because of Donald Trump. He lost this war. And that's going to be hard for him to deal with. He may, he may be drifting towards the Russian position now, but that might just cause him to, to return to the old, basically neocon camp and prosecute the war just as before. So he's protected from those charges of causing the defeat of the Ukrainian army.
It's just kind of amazing that the defeat of the Ukrainian army isn't apparent to everybody at this point, that they would still, it's clear that this is over. And just kind of what we're talking about before, we've talked about how the elites and Western leaders have become victim of their own narrative. Just like you said, this foreign policy magazine saying that Russia is on the verge of defeat is just so far from reality. I mean, you can go to Russia, you can talk to people, you can see it, there's clearly, this is not founded in anything. But I'm just surprised that they've been able to be a victim of their narrative for so long. Yeah. If you've been following this war, even if you were following mainstream media, you should start to see a pattern that something isn't right here, that, why are they keep on advancing? Why are the Ukrainians having trouble to recruit or whatever it is? Are you kind of surprised that they've been able to fall such victims of their own narratives for so long? Or at this point, it's just a refusal to, they do know the truth, but they've gone in so deep that they can't just admit it. So they have to create this false reality and inhabit it, even though they know it's a false reality.
Yeah, I'm somewhat surprised. Again, it's just like the propaganda around this war is really extreme. I mean, we saw a lot of polarization and let's say an information war in domestic politics um, prior to the Ukraine war. I'm talking about COVID and RussiaGate and all that stuff. And you could go to again. You could it seemed clear that these different information spheres were um, developing, and they had very little in common. Like if you spent your time in one sort of information or news ecosystem, you would have a very different understanding of the world than if you spent time in the other. Um, but but all of that actually was looked rather tame or moderate in comparison to what happened after the war broke out in Russia. It's so extreme, and the two sides are so far apart. That sometimes I just wonder, what's the reality? But over time, I think, it's just become increasingly clear what the reality is, and that is that Ukraine is losing, and is losing, with greater and greater rapidity. But people make these. Yeah, it's hard to understand, but it's real. It's just like part of it is that identification of the West, um, the West as the superior system. Not just more prosperous and more powerful militarily, but morally superior. All those things, it's just sort of part of being a Westerner, and and I guess it's just very, very hard for people to let go. That becomes a sense of who they are and what makes them good, and so they fight tooth and nail as the reality begins to indicate otherwise. Um, it is quite remarkable but it just shows the power of that kind of that vision and that faith in the West. It's not just an opinion, it is an identity. It's something that's very deeply held. It clearly is, or it would have been abandoned, quite a long time ago. Um, but yeah, it's still there. And I think that it probably can only, I think there's no question again that that with every passing day, every passing month, the Russians are gaining the upper hand, um, and we're getting closer and closer to a true collapse. We've seen collapses occur on certain sections of the front line, like in Kursk, for example, that was a true collapse. Um, but it'll eventually become a general collapse. I don't know how far that day is, how far away it is, but I would, if the Russians, where right now it's clear that the Ukrainians are on the back foot, and the Russians are advancing pretty much all along the line. At several points on the line, they're making significant advances, and in fact, if you look at like the daily advances expressed in terms of square kilometers, they're back to where they were pretty much in November, which was their peak last year. They accelerated through much of the year to the very end of 2024. And then there was a slowdown for a few months, but now they're back up to where they were at the end of last year. In November, they're advancing quite a bit faster. You see that's the situation now, but then if the Russians commit another, who knows, 240,000 men, and maybe at different points on the front line, it just seems to me that okay, it's so clear that the Ukrainians are just barely hanging on now, and if it wasn't for the drones, it would already be over. But the drone. Their parity or near parity in drones allows them to hang on, but not to. But in the end, they can't hold the line. They're retreating. If that's the situation now, when those 240,000 come in, it's you can the consequences seem to me to be obvious that the line is going to break. It's got to really truly break in certain places, and then we're going to see real obvious advances, and then that's going to change everything. I think the fact that the territorial changes have been slow. And they really have. Even now when we're talking about the faster, more rapid advance, we're still talking about like a decade before, if they continue like at the pace that the Russians continue to advance at the pace that they're advancing right now, it still would take them a decade to get, let's say, southern and all of southern and eastern Ukraine. So that, it is slow. It really is. And that allows people who are whose first instinct, of course, is to believe in Western Europe superiority, to seize upon explanations, say, okay, yeah, the Russians are advancing, but they're going real slow and they're suffering huge losses. That's what the Ukrainians told us. And okay, yeah, somehow with maybe gum and duct tape, they've managed to hold their economy together, but it's under huge strains and it's about to collapse. And, these are the explanations that are offered, and they've been offered again and again. It's on the verge of a collapse. They're about to give up. It's clear that they're not really listening to the Russians. They're not really looking very closely to what's happening, but they can seize on these explanations. It will be much harder to do that, if there really is a collapse, if there, major breakthroughs and the Russian army just goes marching to the Dnieper. And then we'll have to see. It'll be an interesting moment. It's sort of like we've been dealing with this mental patient. How will this mental patient deal with this undeniable reality? What are they going to do? They'll start maybe looking for traitors, and maybe the number one traitor will be Donald Trump. We'll see.
Right. Yeah, I want to go back to what you mentioned about just our identity as the Western, hegemon, the superiority that we have. I think that is the root of a large part of this problem that we have. Our whole identity is about being top dog by a mile. That's what America's all about, and all the European leaders have bought into this identity completely. And the Americas are great champion. We are so powerful because we have the United States. But if we lose this Ukraine war, will that identity just be shattered at that point? Will it be over? Because that is what makes America. My whole life it was America is ahead of every other country by a mile, by miles. Not even close. And I believed it. Everybody did. But over time, especially after I lived in China for so long, I just started to realize things were different. And I'm like, hey, something's not quite right here. And then the Ukraine war just blew it open for me. Like, whoa, this whole thing was a lie. It's a paper tiger. Do you think that will be the outcome of this?
Well, I think it potentially could be. I mean, if it doesn't actually destroy this sense of superiority, it's going to severely damage it. I think, again, like people who are outside of it, who are not part of the West, in other words, the global majority, are looking at it and are recognizing, what you're recognizing, that America isn't the colossus, the hyperpower, that we thought it was, and and it's not just, of course, military, but again, all these things go together: military power, soft power, which is a sense of moral supremacy, which I think is actually very, very important. And then economic power. All those things are, maybe those are the three legs that it stands on. And all of them have taken a real beating. And it's, again, mainly it's outside of the West because, we work hard to convince ourselves that everything's normal. But an unequivocal defeat in Ukraine, where it just becomes clear, that where it becomes absolutely undeniable. Right now, there are ways, because the front is moving slowly. The Russian advances are still, they certainly have accelerated. They're certainly much more rapid than they used to be, but you could still describe them as incremental. But if that changes, and I think it's bound to, because these new forces will be committed to the battle. That's what we're all expecting. And then also because, again, the Russians have pushed through the strongest fortified lines of the Ukrainians already. And in some places, there's really nothing, like where the Russians have entered into Dnipropetrovsk, the new oblast. They just did that the other day. There's really nothing there. There's just it's there aren't any fortifications. It's going to so the combination of new forces and a very different kind of battle environment is going to lead to, I expect, I might be wrong, but I think many of us are expecting a very rapid, a much more rapid advance by the Russians, and that will, I think, inevitably chase away a lot of these illusions. But how they deal with it again is just it's sort of like these people are, I won't say mentally unsound, but it almost seems that way. They're kind of maybe spiritually unsound. It's just this hubris has blinded them, and they've been, behaving in a way that's really self-destructive, and they've been, engaged in just sort of, a denial of reality. But reality eventually always has a way of breaking through, and when it does, we'll find out. We'll find out what they're made of. Will it be a will it be a return to common sense, or will they seize upon some even more far-fetched explanation and behave in an even more reckless manner? Yeah, I think that's going to be a kind of a moment of truth, and it may not be too far in the future.
If when there is just a clear defeat for the Ukrainians, I think a lot of people in America and the West will maybe adopt the attitude. It's like, well, we could beat the Russians, but it just wasn't worth our time. We didn't really try. I think a lot of American military power bros here will have that type of response. How would you respond to that?
Yeah. Well, it's clear that we went all out. And, and if you stop and look at the things that we've said, of course, over the course of this conflict, each time we introduced a new weapon system, we say, okay, now, we're going to give them our HIMARS, or, our small diameter glide bombs, or, we know the Abrams tanks. It's one thing after another, and the F-16s. And I remember all the hype that preceded each of these, and there was just a real certainty, or all the hype that preceded the summer offensive of 2023. Because again, that was, we may now try to pretend that, okay, that was the Ukrainians and they messed up. There's an effort but these are all NATO operations. These are NATO weapon systems. These are, NATO trained and directed and troops. And they were following a NATO battle plan, and they were being supported by NATO intelligence. And that is, for anybody who wants to actually look at it, that's just a fact. Again, there was that very, very long article in the New York Times. What was it, a month or two ago? That which even the dissidents like us kind of found surprising, the extent of U.S. and NATO involvement in all the Ukrainian operations. It wasn't just strategic or operational; it was actually tactical. It's like, okay, we see something with our satellite here, attack this hill. And that's what they were doing. So, anybody who knows anything, and and maybe that's a small minority, but certainly, military analysts, people working in the Pentagon and so on, they know. And it's going to be a real shock to them. And I think maybe they are already kind of experiencing a lot of concern. But will we be able to spin it? Yeah, we're pretty good at that. There have been a lot of disasters, everything from the Iraq War, the Libya intervention, and with just these things have ended. These interventions, of course, these are different. We're talking much smaller countries, and a direct intervention. They've ended disastrously, but it's amazing how we can just shift the focus, and it's just like, it's just forgotten. That didn't work out. We don't talk about that anymore. And then we go on to the next conflict. I guess what's different about this is it's just not going to work. This was too big. It was it's in Europe. And yeah, there will be an effort to kind of to spin it and to pretend that didn't really matter much. But I think that's going to be hard to pull off after all the things that have said, and all the conferences that have been held by the Western leaders, and all the the big talk by and threats from people like Macron and Starmer and so on. I think it's it's not just a few things they said, but over the course of years they repeated it again and again, and this war has raged, and it's just not going to. I don't. If they try to say, let's not talk about this anymore, let's. I don't think they're going to succeed. So yeah, it may not destroy the sense of Western superiority, but I think it's going to damage it seriously.
When do you think this is all over? Do you think there will even be Ukraine left? Or is there a possibility that it will go like the Yugoslavia route? It could be absorbed by neighboring countries. Obviously, Russia's going to be taking a lot. Maybe Hungary and Poland take a
Yeah.
bit, and some new states get created or something like this. Will there be no Ukraine when this is over?
That's a possibility. It's hard to say. Again, another possibility is that the ultranationalists will retreat to their homeland, which is Western Ukraine. With its capital in Lvov, and and just entrench themselves there, um, and fight off all this secessionist movements. It's not just again, the Russians that are being suppressed, but as you pointed out, like Hungarians and Romanians, there's an effort to suppress their language or the teaching of those languages in schools and so forth. So there is a potential, like you say, for other regions to break away, especially if Ukraine is greatly weakened. Of course, it will be greatly weakened, but I don't know if they'll. It, but it still remains unclear whether or not they'll be able to hang on to those regions. I think there is a risk of them losing it. It's true. It just may be that, I say that on one hand, we may have kind of a very unified ultranationalist Ukraine in the West, and that is able to hold on to all its territories in the West with Western support. But then we may also just see chaos. It may be that, there's a possibility of civil war, and who knows what that could lead to. And in that chaos, yeah, other regions could break away. But that's all. It's in the distant future, maybe not in terms of time. All those things could happen in a year or two, but it's far removed from the current situation. But again, it's just like if the Russians advance, they cross the Dnieper, then who knows? It's the question is, how is the West going to react to it? How is Ukraine going to react to it? Is there going to be just a stiffening of resolve and a kind of a further rallying around the ultranationalist flag there? Or will there be Ukrainians that start to turn on the ultranationalists? Right now, we don't see it, but maybe under extreme pressures that might change.